just want me not to produce the panel, it's fine. You can tell me.
Sorry, she takes me down. She's so...
I have a terrible habit of sliding into bad accents. I should stop that. I don't know why I do that.
Tell me what you want home. Tell me why. Sell it.
It's your... You do.
Forget about that.
I just think Chomsky, everyone talks about him. Everyone has seen that. Not everyone, but you know what I mean. Which was in 3. And I think Hall is fabulous, but I think it's a tougher concept to come to grips with. But I think it is a more radical concept in many ways.
All right, you sold it. You know how she's so manipulative. She just puts these sentences in the middle of stuff that she knows is going to massage me. Okay, let's go. Okay, we'll do Edward Said first. We'll do Edward Said first. Then we'll sandwich Roland Barthes. Yeah. And then we'll go through.
Hall. I love Zero. How long are you going to be at PC?
Just for the night, and then leaving early morning.
From there?
Yeah.
Oh.
To Paris.
Oh, okay.
Complicated.
What's in Paris? What's happening there?
A lover.
Oh, nice.
Even better.
And then how long are you going to be in Paris?
For 3 days.
Only 3 days.
How is it? How do you... It's bizarre. I don't know how to even ask you. How is Cairo? How is it to function there?
It's like a shithole.
Oh, Lena.
Yeah, I'm so oblivious to it, and then certain moments bring it all to me. Like in the morning today, when Richard was running me through the questions. Like, oh my god, this hurts.
Ready to go? I'm going to give it 2 more minutes.
This is a bit empty. This is a bit empty of our colleagues. These guys might as well come to the front.
What's really interesting to me is when I see slightly empty panels, the people who are there interest me. So why are you?
They should come forward.
This is the interesting bunch.
Yeah,
This is the
this is the
interesting
bunch
thing.
who saw critical frames and decided they want to come here.
Oh, actually, it's better for them to be behind, isn't it?
Please, can you introduce me as Soya Samora? Let's begin, Raswala. We can begin. Now, what's the time? Is it 4?
Yeah?
Why not? Yeah.
Who's ready?
Yes.
Who's ready?
The mic is ready.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. My name is Marcela Pizarro. I work for the Listening Post at Al Jazeera, which is the channel's media critique show. Meenakshi Ravi is the executive producer on the show. Initially, we were meant to be having Soria Samora, who's had to escape to Sierra Leone to carry on filming a documentary. Meen has kindly taken his place and has been very, very involved with me in a media theory project that we're going to be showing you. Lina Atala is an Egyptian journalist who has been at the festival. Luckily, we have the pleasure of having her here and has also taken part in this project. We commissioned articles to come off the back of the project, and she wrote about one of the theorists. I think that one of the first things I'd say, just to place the reason for this, is that I work for a media critique show that on a weekly basis critiques media narratives, traces the discourses of power behind those narratives, unveils their modes of production, traces the economics of the business of news. And one of the central points of our show always tends to be what comes down to representation, the notion of representation, the power to represent, the very fact that the moment that one does represent, there's a power dynamic going on there, which it's something that's implicit in a lot of the work we do. And for years we talk about it outside of the show. And so with Mina, we decided to make that explicit. And we decided to do a project called Media Theorized, where we chose 5 thinkers, difficult, challenging, unsettling, destabilizing, dangerous thinkers, in my opinion, that provide lenses through which media can be demystified, the news media can be demystified, and and they help us provide x-rays of how power functions. We chose Noam Chomsky, American linguist and political activist. We chose Roland Barthes, French philosopher, writing in the 1950s, very much from the literary, he's a literary theorist, a philosopher. He was an outsider, even within the realms of literature. But we thought he'd be useful in order to apply his notions of fiction to what we often think is reality. We looked at Stuart Hall, Marxist historian, Jamaican-British cultural critic, who makes us think about race, gender, ethnicity, and representation in news. And we also included Marshall McLuhan, Canadian literary academic, historian turned high priest of media theory. And last but not least, for anybody working at Al Jazeera, and hopefully for all of you here, one of the most important people for us is Edward Said, literary historian, comparative literature, author of Orientalism, the man who invited us to think about the power of framing in Western narratives about the other countries, the global south, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk, this is going to be very much a conversation with amongst us and also amongst you guys, so please, you're invited to interrupt whenever you like. Lena wrote the article about Roland Barthes around the notion of the death of the author, so we invite you to kill us too during this session. We're going to start off with Edward Said. These pieces were done as animations. They last about 2 minutes, and they're explainers of the central concepts behind these theorists. We'll start with Edward Said.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through the refining fire of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works, not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justified through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves, the exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype. Decode the fiction. unlearn the myth.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Which one are we going to show next?
Which one were we doing?
Let's do Roland Barthes.
Roland Barthes.
Switch on the
Oh, sorry guys.
TV. What do you see? The breaking news graphic, the scrolling text, the news presenter behind the desk. Read the signs, the hair, the makeup, the suit. What is this story about? The rhythm of the words, numbers, colors. Why are these codes here? The music, the size of the letters. How do you feel? A news bulletin is a selection of signs, the flow of words, read off the autocue, the artifice of the presenter's cadence, the news voice, the gaze looking right at you, but through a lens, visual stand-ins for credibility, authority, legitimacy, rhetorical motifs constructing the biggest myth of all, that what we are watching is unmediated reality. This is what Roland Barthes would have seen. The TV screen as a cultural text, and he would have unveiled its myths. Because to read symbols and signs, to interpret them, is the work of a semiotician. In the 1950s, Barthes started writing about popular culture. In his book Mythologies, he gathered multiple discordant subjects: food, horoscopes, religion, advertising, toys, photography, detergents. He saw these as elements of mass culture, imbued with ideology, providing society with the myths that once came from fables and epics. Barthes said, the starting point of these reflections was usually a feeling of impatience at the sight of the naturalness with which newspapers, art, and common sense constantly dress up a reality which is undoubtedly determined by history. Barthes didn't just spotlight the myths that surround us. He put back the curtain on their ideological premises. He warned us against taking all that surrounds us at face value. The fonts in your daily newspaper, they don't just reflect meaning, they add it, they change it. The framing of this shot, what's the history behind it? The selfie, the latest representation of the bourgeois individual. The stick, a seal of authenticity, of status. The subtitle, the voice as text. What could be more Barthesian?
And the last one is Stuart Hall, the Jamaican British cultural historian. There's another two. There's Noam Chomsky and Marshall McLuhan. We've just decided to do these three for the time being.
We live in a world saturated with media. We see our reality through them, but these are not transparent operations. They involve the workings of power. Stuart Hall was an outsider, born in colonial Jamaica, educated in Oxford. He was out of place in both. He left academia, the literary canon, high culture, to become an intellectual of mass culture. What he did was controversial. He was looking at the power of mainstream media in representing race, gender, class, ethnicity, religion. Hall said those discourses are not innocent, that hidden in mass media is ideology. The media theorist's job is to find that ideology, expose it, critique it. The media's racialization of crime, the patriarchal narratives on gender, the othering of immigrants, Muslims, the poor. The media are active agents in this process. But what of the masses? The audience is watching. Hall broke with the presumption that the masses are dumb, passive. In fact, he questioned who the faceless masses even are. Some may accept the dominant meanings embedded in the media. Some may negotiate them. Others outright reject them. Where other media theorists argued that messages are imposed on people from above, Hall said power is not as simple as that. He saw pockets of resistance that undermine dominant media narratives. Think of the bloggers in Tunisia, the graffiti artists of Brazil. Black Lives Matter. But Hall went further. He also told us to seek out stories elsewhere, in the lowly, despised spaces of knowledge. The gossip mags, the soap opera, the music videos. If you want to understand society, then maybe avoid the news. Those formalised spaces that house official discourse. Find different stories, different perspectives, different realities.
So those are three. I think there's nothing innocent about three people sitting here in this panel. One's from Latin America, another one's from the Middle East, from Egypt, and another one's from India. And without overstating them, they're three women. So what a reader brings, as Stuart Hall would have argued, to a text is just as powerful as what the author would have intended. And I'd just like to open that up for Lena, who wrote about Roland Barthes within the context of Egypt today, and just for you to talk to us about why you think a French philosopher that was producing during the 50s is important for an Egyptian journalist working out of Cairo today.
Okay, thank you, Marcella, and thank you everyone for coming. I know we are up for a major competition with all the panels that talk about how to optimize our use of Facebook and Twitter and so on. So I'm very thankful for the crowd in this room. I got very excited when Marcella approached me with this idea of writing this text, trying to localize or at least engage with / make sense out of what Roland Barthes has to say for a journalist. And I think not only for the local Egyptian context do I find this kind of reading crucial, I find it crucial for the entire global practice of journalism today that is highly, in my opinion, hegemonized by by the technical, by the technology, and so on. And why I find it useful, there is the obvious, layer of the theory, which is basically that since, there is an act of power embedded in representation, it is important to remember that an author does that much or should do that much to a text, and that, as Barthes says, the reader should be the locus of a text as opposed to a writer. So we should have this humility as writers and authors and journalists to open up our texts, to open up our production for readers to engage with them and to create meaning out of them, as opposed to forcing that meaning, which is what a lot of the institutions of power that engineer the media industry today do. So there is this direct layer, and then there is this additional layer that has to do with media practice today that claims a lot about being user-centric, and much of the global media conferences I go to today are all centered around this idea of how to build your audience and how to engage your audience. And it's very interesting to find that there's nothing of that theory in the discourse or in the conversation. If we're talking about audience engagement, how about, we start by addressing how we're writing and the extent to which, again, we're opening our text to our readers, as opposed to how much traffic we're bringing to our websites. So I think it's relevant in that context as well. So there is the political layer of, again, how the state or how big institutions of power are forcing meaning through the vehicle of the media, and there is the other layer of the political economy of the media and the political economy of knowledge production in general.
Mina, I'd like to ask you about actually who your favorite one was. And this is not an inane question, because I think that when these theorists speak to us, there is something in there about a politics of identity, and also about something that you always thought was probably there but didn't quite know how to, or hadn't quite articulated. So I'd just like to ask you who spoke to you the most.
I think what was most interesting, we chose, when we were working on this project, we chose 5 theorists. And of them, I think the one that, the theorist who I think is close to the hearts of many Al Jazeera journalists especially, is Edward Said. For me, even prior to Al Jazeera, Said spoke to me as a journalist, and even as a consumer of the news. And this is not simply in how we dissect or analyze Western media reporting on the Eastern or the Southern other. I see it in India itself, in the context of Indian journalism, how we otherize those within our own country, within our own communities, and the ability for us to impose stereotypes, cliches, to impose representations on other communities that we want to marginalize. So Said was especially alluring because the way in which he framed that was unique. I must say, the person who voiced that video, Surya Samura, I'm sitting in his place. He is a Sierra Leonean journalist. And one of the reasons why we had chosen him so specifically for this was because Surya Samura's work is so particular in that it is exactly it is everything that Said was not critiquing. It's very much journalism that is from that soil, that is of its people. And in fact, one of his first films was Cry Freetown, which had huge impact on me when I was young. And that is how it felt like a full circle when we came to the Edward Said video and thought of Surya Samura to voice it as a journalist who has really kind of embodied, prior to what Al Jazeera was trying to do, in getting people to speak for themselves, to represent themselves, and not to impose on them the assumptions, the questions, and the prejudices that we bring from the outside, even without wanting to be prejudiced or biased. So it was always Said for me.
Does anyone want to ask any questions now? Because there may be questions now that might feed into this conversation. Go ahead.
This is really interesting. I actually have 2 questions, if that's all right. The first is on how you came about choosing these theorists. Sorry, I'll repeat that. The first question is how you came about choosing these theorists. In particular, I mean, they do represent kind of the foundations of media studies, but why go back and use these foundations versus more contemporary scholars in media studies, particularly, for instance, scholars studying feminism? I notice you don't have a woman there, or intersectionality or queer theory, which has equal relevance for journalism in parts other than, North America. And then my second question is about, maybe we could save this for later, but I'll ask it anyways, is about, one of the major kind of anxieties in the field of media critique and media studies, and I'm a professor of media studies, is that our work doesn't really matter in the real world. So I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about that. Like, in your work and in your research, can academics have an impact, maybe even specifically media critics, academic media critics, can they have an impact on the real world? And if so, what kind of impact can we have?
Okay, thank you. Very important. Both things that we've thought and talked about a lot. in terms of choosing the theorists, I chose them. So the reason why I chose those theorists, at least 3 of them, were this was a first layer in rehearsing through some really key thoughts that obviously to somebody like you, you can see what we're doing. We're laying the foundations of the Frankfurt School. We're trying to go through how mass media is to be theorized, is to be thought about critically. You know, Hall inherited Raymond Williams, who inherited the Frankfurt School. Who else? Chomsky is a denunciator and an agent provocateur. He basically reflects those kinds of positions too. Marshall McLuhan is important because I think Marshall McLuhan was a fun one. He's prophetic. His media prophecies are fun to look at today because this privileging of form over content speaks to a reality that we're living today, and it's a kind of introduction or a way into theorizing over this privileging of form over content, and actually, for me, invites us to think about how problematic that actually is. Because we are now in an age where substance, information, the quality of information is at threat, right? So all of those thinkers, Stuart Hall deals a lot with gender. All of those for me were a first layer. My idealized audience isn't new. It's people who really haven't thought about these people. They're people who are studying journalism and are going straight down the line. I want to go and report on what's apparently going on. I'm journalists that are being told that they are going to be purveyors of truth and are going to represent an unmediated reality. And I think that those are the people that if they are taught to think more critically will start producing a different kind of journalism. In terms of the second part of your question, so the absence of women, I'm going to put this one to Alina because we're talking she's got an interesting take on this and I think it's important to listen to.
I mean, I first want to engage with that question about, critical media, critical theory and media practice and this dissociation between the two, which I find extremely alarming. So not only I think the work of academics or the work of theory is useful, I think it should be embodied in any newsroom. And, just to give you a practical example, so I run this small independent media organization in Cairo, and we are in the process of setting up a new round of contracts for all our team members, and these contracts include a set of metrics. Some of them are related to audience building and the kind of audiences that their stories are building and how they are engaging with the audiences, but I'm also making it part of the metrics to be able to read a number of seminal texts on a yearly basis, either general or related to their beats. So there's no way someone wants to cover women issues in Egypt does not read Judith Butler, for example, especially that they have access to it because they are perfectly bilingual and some of these texts are translated to Arabic. So it's, I like this idea of smuggling theoretical texts in the newsroom as much as we take, trainings about other things related to the technical aspect of the practice, and I think it's important, and its scarcity is quite alarming. And as far as the theorists are concerned, I think this is just the beginning of a longer process that should continue doing, and I'm very thankful that the Listening Post and Marcella and the entire team and Mina, they took this initiative. I think next step should be, doing more specific, critical theorists, including people like Hannah Arendt and so on, who have things to say about the media. There's something about these guys' broader sort of theories on the media in general, but there are specific things related to gender and representation where it would be nice to see the works of theorists. And as Marcella said, it's interesting that she gave the space to women to actually engage with these theories. So,
can I just say one thing, Marcella? Can I just add one thing, just to add, because this hurts. Julia Kristeva, very important. In terms of how language affects representation, the French feminists who absolutely rip language apart and unveil the patriarchy behind those kinds of structures. Even Susan Sontag on photography, key texts, and these things are very important to us, so I totally take your point.
I just wanted to pick up on two things that Lena was saying. You know, in the process of putting this together, as Lena said, you know, she likes the idea of smuggling these critical texts into the newsroom. And something that Marcella and I spoke a lot about is the fact that it does feel like you're smuggling it in some point, because people are wondering, hi, chop chop, you know, where's your copy? And I personally have found myself enriched. You know, I wouldn't say that this came naturally to me. A lot of it came through my work with Marcella, that we bring this critical theory into our work. Critique is about so much more than, you know, we're taught in journalism school, right? Journalism 101, speak truth to power, you ask the skeptical question, all of that, but the workings of these theories I felt were so much subtler and added so much more nuance to the way in which we think. And the second answer, relating to the female thinkers and thinkers beyond the ones we've chosen, I think there was a lot of grappling over it. There were 3 women in the production of this project, and we were all thinking, you know, are we making a mistake here? And I think Lena has understood it perfectly. We are layering up. There are elements of production that limit you, but also, as Marcella said, you are, you know, all of you who are here, you're already engaged in critical theory. We were really looking to put this out in an ecosystem where the videos that get the most clicks are how to make oat flake porridge and, you know, how to make pancakes with 10 kinds of blueberries. Those are the videos that get clicks.
The ones that you watch.
Yeah, the ones that I watch. You know, hands up, I say, you know, tasty, proper, tasty, all of them. These are the ones I follow. We wanted to put out something that brought into this space these kind of ideas, this kind of content. And it was important for us to kind of take it, you know, building blocks. That's what we wanted to do. So with all of that ambition in mind, we're hoping that our next set completely moves beyond this space. But thank you for asking.
Anybody else? Any other questions? We can hear you.
Yeah.
Everyone can hear.
Everybody's so polite.
Okay, I have just one short, straightforward question. What are the production costs for these videos, and how long did it take to produce them?
Very interesting question.
I mean, the production cost is probably quite an interesting, has its own kind of story behind it. I think there's many other stories around it that have got more political anecdotes, but over to you, Mina.
To be frank, it's a very valid question you ask, because these things, of course, are not cheap, and to find the money to invest in projects like this is not easy also. We made a conscious decision when we were doing this that we wanted to choose artists, narrators, and any other collaborator we worked with. We wanted them to be of a global sensibility. We didn't want it all to be centered in London where we work, right? So, and the other important thing is we didn't want people who had established such a set style that they wouldn't be able to kind of open up their own boundaries and work with us. So we worked with a very global set of artists, many of whom were fresh out of art school, and that had a dual role to play. Firstly, it meant that we were working with people who were almost like a blank slate in terms of their own production. And when they looked at our scripts, they reacted to it kind of very viscerally without any kind of form or format in mind. And of course, budget-wise also. I'll be honest, there's no secret about these things. This is essential to our work. I would say each one of these videos, and I'm generalizing, I'm being average here, I would say give or take $10,000. And in this, I'm including the artist's work, the work of the scripting, the work of the sound artists, the narrators. I'm not even quantifying time, effort, money, sweat, staff costs, and stuff like that. This is our, you know, our baseline. You asked an honest question, I gave an honest answer.
Now we're facing a whole different reality in the past few years with the social networks and the rise of video. I've been thinking and writing about this, but I've always spotted a theoretical poverty when it comes to these things, at least in applying theory to understand and to inform the debate about these newer problems. You know, it starts from privacy to collective behavior, to gaze theory, many aspects. And I'm really surprised that the academia is not producing almost any theory about, I mean, as far as I know. I'm outside academia for a few years. I'm probably not aware. But what do you think, what do you suggest? I mean, have you seen any work, serious work about these things?
I mean, yes, academia is producing a lot of studies. I think the point there has got its own history and its own politics to it. The production of knowledge in academia on journalism is one market, but paradoxically, it has little contact with the real world of journalism. So there's a structural issue going on there, which means that the economics of academia may well produce very interesting material, but it doesn't. There's no bridge. But there's plenty of work being done, theorizing, you know, chronicling the digital revolution, the social media age, the, you know, privacy, surveillance, etc. We speak to people on the program every week, and there's a wealth of very intelligent, critical thought out there. I think that what our point here was to bring those voices in, and to go to classic texts in order to build kind of infrastructure for young people in order to immediately become discerning consumers. In fact, I don't even like that word consumers, but to give them agency and for them to become discerning journalists.
Also, you know, just a quick thought. I think if we're experiencing a number of crises, in my opinion, one of them is this idea of incarcerating knowledge within certain institutions, or the ability to produce theory within certain settings. And, you know, I'm a true believer of praxis, which is that really knowledge lies at the intersection of theory and practice. And this is yet another thing that we try to smuggle to the newsroom, because I think journalists, as ethnographers, as anthropologists, as people who are living day-to-day realities and producing thoughts about them, should also be producers of theory in many ways. So I think this is also a call to the necessity of intersectionality and ongoing collaborations between academics and journalists and other knowledge producers, because that's the only possibility of for producing meaningful theory.
I want to make one point, Hussein. You know, in your question, you said, kind of, you know, you said, oh, well, I'm not in academia anymore. This is the whole point. I do think, especially of late, with the areas in which we're talking about, where so much of journalism has become technology-centric, right? And like what Lina said, there are a number of journalists today who are doing very academic work, really. They're still practicing journalists. I would, like, the names that come immediately to mind, and I'm not saying this because you sit in front of me. If I was to close my mind sometimes in the production of the show, you close your eyes and you think, who has thought about this at a level that takes it beyond the mundane, okay? Someone who can see the technology for what it is doing beyond just encouraging you to click and watch and rack up views. There's Zeynep Tüfekçi, there's someone like yourself, there's Evgeny Morozov. All three of you are not, you know, not formally in academia, but you're producing work of, you know, you're theorizing around this space that we all inhabit so mindlessly. And I completely agree with Lina. I mean, it's no longer that critical theory is kind of in this privileged space which is so distant from lived practice. What I love about some of Zeynep Tüfekçi's work is something happened over the weekend. You know, give her a week, and she's produced a 2,000-word article that breaks it down for you and tells you, guys, move beyond the clicks and the likes. Look at how it is interacting with your life, your mind, and the way in which you discern what's happening. So don't be so self-effacing.
There was a question somewhere.
I'm very fascinated by, or interested in bringing theory into the newsroom, and very impressed that you make your journalists read Butler. And I work, for example, in quite a mainstream Norwegian daily. How do I smuggle theory into my newsroom and make my colleagues read it? And what should I have them read?
I cook for them. This is smart. And then, and then make them drink and then put it as a metric in their contracts. Yeah, I think it's a sensibility really more than anything else, and it's a culture that you cultivate. Some people have more interest in it than the others, but also if it becomes a contagion at some point, if a few people are already talking about it in the newsroom, it will just filter its way through to the others who are not interested in theory. So I think it's a sensibility that you try to address, and I think that there is, some things are seminal, all of us need to read and so on. And then, some things are brought up in a timely manner because of their relevance to a surrounding event. So, for example, in Egypt, a couple of years ago, there was massive violence. There still is, but, 2 years ago, we saw 3 years ago, we saw actual massacres where, people in the hundreds would be killed in broad daylight and so on. So in that context, we needed to seek the comfort of reading how people wrote about violence. So this is when we started reading Fanon in the newsroom. So it's also using the event and the need to consume something beyond the closed narratives of the media that, don't put you before any possibility. It just tells you what's going on in a very closed way.
I'd also say that actually journalism is an extremely competitive field, and I'm kind of speaking despite myself because it goes against certain kinds of principles, but in a competitive field, you need to learn to know what's important, and these kinds of thinkers take you further, push you further in thought, and it makes you better, because it makes you take risks intellectually and editorially, and it makes you ask questions. It teaches you how to ask questions and reframe the questions. So in a field that's kind of exceeding its limits, I think one of the things is to encourage people to read critically in order to become better journalists.
And, all of us might not be as good at cooking as Lena is, but I would say that it's a sensibility, it's about bringing it into the newsroom, but also very much it so clearly affects the quality of your journalism, it'll be impossible for your colleagues not to see. If I take the example of, Marcella and I work on the same team. We're in a team of 10, let's say. Each one brings their own perspective, their own thought. Marcella brings with her that volume of knowledge of critical theory. And it has such a clear impact in distinguishing her work. I think all of us have become readers of theory because of one person on a team. I really think that watching someone's work be transformed by that, I think is quite contagious. You can't always, it's not always about bringing the book in and keeping, although she does that too. But it's really about seeing how someone's work is distinguished by that knowledge and by that depth. And as journalists are so competitive, they will start reading whatever they need to.
Somebody else wants to ask questions.
This is right. I'm a big fan of these videos. I'd seen them before, and I was just warmed my heart to see that you guys were pushing these out to a general audience, and the way that they were packaged for a particular audience was just really delightful. One thing I've been thinking about in this conference and in the past few months in this conversation, or more like frenzy over fake news, is I'm seeing, and I might be missing something, but might be there, but I'm just not seeing it yet, a lack of critical theory in that conversation, where I actually think that it applies very, very, very well. And speaking of smuggling things into the newsroom, I wonder if this isn't the perfect opportunity to smuggle critical theory into a conversation that's just absolutely ripe for that kind of contribution.
My response is that I don't know the answer to that, and my thoughts are far too loose, and I suspect that fake news as a media critique narrative is a red herring. So I'm going to leave it there. Mina or Lena?
Start with Lena, no? I mean, this is a discussion we've been having even in the listening post, yeah? Fake news as a moniker, so to speak. It's interesting that it has come into such currency right now. Having worked on the listening post for 10 years, frankly, I would say that we've been dealing with shades of fake news for a while.
That's exactly what
Yeah.
I mean.
And critical theory does play into that. You make a very valid point. A lot of the ways in which journalists, media houses are dealing with the threat of fake news is to put out videos saying, here's how you can find out when a story is fake. Do a reverse Google search, do a blah, blah, blah. And you're absolutely right. This would be the juncture, this would be the entry point for us to say, hold on, guys. There's so much that you could arm yourself with in terms of critical theory, in terms of historicizing what you're seeing. So actually, you're making a very valid point. If you, like me, live in the social media ecosystem, you're completely correct that I don't think there has been enough of that injected into our heads as to how to deal with fake news. But I feel that many people who have been thinking critically about the media will be the first to say that fake news is just the latest label attached to something that Chomsky was talking about when he talked about manufacturing consent.
Right.
You know, you make a good point, and most probably in our next video. Anyone else?
Give us some examples of interesting works that you've recently seen in academia discussing these new problems, please.
Wow, Hussein, you should just watch our back catalogue.
I mean, yeah, you should watch our shows.
To be quite frank.
You can tweet them and I'll see them later on.
We have the presenter at the back, and he's got a very good memory. Richard?
You made a conscious decision the visuals are one thing, the theories are another. Sound is a very important part of media, modern media, and you made a decision to step away from conventional, deep, gravelly broadcast voices.
Your voice.
Or the conventional. Talk to us a little bit about that. And insofar as the question from our Norwegian colleague on how to smuggle these kinds of videos into newsrooms and have them consumed, because getting them into the newsroom is one thing. Having them consumed is another. Did you think about perhaps presenting these in the form perhaps of YouTube cat videos? Because that may have helped.
In terms of the audio, that has a whole story itself. So this has been, in fact, this was a fight that we wanted to win. We could have had professional voiceovers. Stuart Hall is voiced by Black Lives Matter founder Natalie Jeffers in the UK. That's a story in itself. She's talking about Hall, who she was deeply influenced by. Noam Chomsky was voiced by Amy Goodman. There's a direct link there. You know, obviously Amy Goodman's work is, and she often, in fact, mentions and indeed interviews Chomsky. Saeed was voiced by Soria Samora, African journalist. We're talking about representation. We're talking about the power to represent your own stories. So we thought that he was extremely relevant there. Marshall McLuhan, one of the hardest ones, because we took a risk, and there may be a lot of people who won't understand it even. It's calling on people to twist their ears and work harder, not just mentally, but even on an audio level, to listen to an accent that comes from Hong Kong. Alex Chow was the president of the Umbrella Movement, and we thought it was important for somebody who used social media to such effect to voice over something about a Canadian. Roland Barthes was Carlos Latouf, who is a Brazilian satirist who doesn't speak English very well. And most of that was cut up we spent 2 hours recording it. And I think there's a whole theory to be made out of that one too, but it was the voice of the South. He was Brazilian. He was also very engaged in the Egyptian Revolution. He, you know, his cartoons during the Egyptian Revolution were very special to Egyptians, I think I'm right in saying. And so we think it was a fight worth insisting on.
And if I may, I think also it really tells you how much the whole production of these videos was informed by the theories that we're producing the videos on. The fight, Marcella doesn't articulate who on the opposite side. Many times it was, I mean, some of the artists were shocked at the quality of voiceover they were getting. You know, the people who did Roland Barthes, they eventually came around to our idea, but they were like, he's got an accent we can't get our heads around. And we were like, that's fine. But this is the language we all speak. But also fundamental to this was so much of, it is about representation, just like Stuart Hall or Said say. We decide that the mainstream voice, I don't know, why should I as an Indian think that the mainstream voice on Facebook should be a North American male? But many Indians do think that. Like my own friends who watched the video, they're like, why did you use that voice? You know, that Hong Kong guy. Like you could have had it been so much clearer if you had chosen the standard broadcast voice. But in our production of this, we were so affected by these theories themselves that we felt it would be such a disservice for these to be voiced conventionally with some, you know, with someone who voices for, as a profession. Regarding cat videos, Richard, we were tempted at one point. We thought the opening frame should be like a kitten playing with knitting needles and like a little ball of wool, but then, again, that would have been a disservice, given that we were producing long videos that completely defy the canon on Facebook. About 5 minutes left.
Somebody else was going to ask something, yeah?
Yes, I have a question. I don't know if I should ask it. I was struck by the fact that this whole event, and it's normal, I mean, journalism has had and still has a hard time funding itself more often than not. So I was struck by the sponsors who are present here in Perugia for this journalism event. And so I'm like, since we're talking about constructing the media and building appearances and representation, could you guys say something about that? About Google, Facebook, Amazon, and Eni, I think?
Yeah, I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it to these two diplomats.
Lena, you go.
Well, you don't have to answer. I mean, it's just something that was on the top of my mind. Thanks.
I mean, I'm obviously an agent in this entire enterprise. You know, I have the speaker badge. I've been having my dinner for free for the last 3 days, staying in a nice hotel. So there is that much critique I can put in there. I guess the only thing I'll say is that it is important, while being, you know, inevitably caught up in the power dynamics of these institutions. You know, to speak more simply, I cannot disseminate my content in isolation from Facebook. I have to inhabit the language of Facebook and be part of it in order to reach my audience. This is what matters. But while doing that, I'm not going to divorce myself from other equally important sensibilities and continue to be critical to Facebook and their practices in my very content. So it's, you know, a mutual embodiment somehow. They need me to be here. So, you know, at the end of the day, Facebook won't be what it is without us, without the users, without we have become its product basically, but at the same time we have to be, you know, smart products in how we engage with it and critique it and not just be submitted to it somehow. So.
And if I may, I think if you wanted to talk about this in terms of critical theory, I mean, I think it is this kind of, this friction between what we do as journalists and the people we need to fund it. It's all about commercialization, it's about capitalism, right? Like Marx, Gramsci, they would actually break this down for us. Journalism has become so commercialized and commodified. We have put ourselves into a system where we cannot conceive of our work without this kind of funding model or this particular kind of framework in which we have to function. So we've fallen victim to a system that has been built for a long time. We can critique it right now. How to break it, I don't think we've worked that out sufficiently yet. But it's definitely a space for critical theory. And I would say a lot of journalists live with a lot of huge frictions and ironies surrounding their work every day, all the time.
Who wants to watch a last video before we go?
Which one? I think actually the choice should be, we have 2 videos left, Chomsky or McLuhan. Does anyone have a preference? I think we did a good job with Alex Chow. I hope you love it.
In the 1960s, way before anybody had ever tweeted, Facebook Lived, or sent classified information to WikiLeaks, one man made a series of pronouncements about the changing media landscape. His name was Marshall McLuhan, and you've probably heard his most quoted line, "The medium is the message." McLuhan's theories on the media were groundbreaking in the 60s, and if you read them today, they would seem prophetic. McLuhan was writing about the effects of the mass media on our lives, but he wasn't talking about the content, the information itself. He was talking about the form, the technologies that provide you with content. McLuhan wasn't saying that content is inconsequential. He was saying that when we pay too much attention to it, we ignore the power of form in shaping our experience. So, if you don't understand the medium, you don't fully understand the message. Think about it. Once upon a time, books were handwritten, but someone invented the printing press and mass media became a reality. The form changed our collective experience. It informed identity, how we imagined ourselves. Same with electronic media, telegraphs, telephones, television, devices that redefined time and space and extended our experience beyond our boundaries. Then came the World Wide Web, the internet. It has changed how we live in the world.
That a medium is not something neutral. It does something to people. It takes hold of them, it roughs them up, it massages them, it bumps them around. Another strange effect of this electric environment is the total absence of secrecy. With the end of secrecy goes the end of monopolies of knowledge.
Everything happens at once. There's no continuity, there's no connection, there's no follow through. It's just all now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Yes, you did. Of course you did. I recognize you. Good. How have you been enjoying yourself? Yes.
No, still not buying it. This is great. You guys basically have my dream job. Everybody wants to listen.
I can't hear you. You're very sophisticated. Huh? You're very sophisticated. If you just want me not to produce the panel, it's fine. You can tell me.
Sorry, she gets me down. She's so...
I have a terrible habit of sliding into bad accents. I should stop that. I don't know why I do that.
Tell me what you want more.
Huh?
Tell me why. Sell it.
It's your you do.
Forget about that.
I just think Chomsky, everyone talks about him. Everyone has seen that. Not everyone, but you know what I mean. Which was in 3. And I think Hall was
saw that, you know that she's so manipulative. She just puts these sentences in the middle of stuff that she knows is going to massage me. Okay, let's go. Okay, we'll do Edward Said first. We'll do Edward Said first. Then we'll sandwich Roland Barthes. And then we'll go through. Oh, I love Zero.
How long are you going to be at PC?
Just for the night, and then leaving early morning.
From there?
Yeah.
Oh,
To Paris.
Oh, okay.
Complicated.
What's in Paris? What's happening there?
A lover.
Oh, nice.
Even better.
And then how long are you going to be in Paris?
For 3 days.
Really? Only 3 days. How is it? How do you... It's bizarre. I don't know how to even ask you. How is Cairo? How is it to function there?
It's like a shithole.
Oh, Lena.
Yeah, I'm so oblivious to it, and then certain moments bring it all to me. Like in the morning today, when Richard was running me through the questions. Like, oh my god, this hurts.
Of the business of news. And one of the central points of our show always tends to be what comes down to representation, the notion of representation, the power to represent, the very fact that the moment that one does represent, there's a power dynamic going on there, which is something that's implicit in a lot of the work we do. And for years we talk about it outside of the show. And so with Mina, we decided to make that explicit. And we decided to do a project called Media Theorized, where we chose 5 thinkers, difficult, challenging, unsettling, destabilizing, dangerous thinkers, in my opinion, that provide lenses through which media can be demystified, the news media can be demystified, and we can... and they help us provide x-rays of how power functions. We chose Noam Chomsky, American linguist and political activist. We chose Roland Barthes, French philosopher, writing in the 1950s, very much from the literary, he's a literary theorist, a philosopher. He was an outsider, even within the realms of literature. But we thought he'd be useful in order to apply his notions of fiction to what we often think is reality. We looked at Stuart Hall, Marxist historian, Jamaican-British cultural critic, who makes us think about race, gender, ethnicity, and representation in news. And we also included Marshall McLuhan, Canadian literary academic, historian turned high priest of media theory. And last but not least, for anybody working at Al Jazeera, and hopefully for all of you here, one of the most important people for us is Edward Said, literary historian, comparative literature, author of Orientalism, the man who invited us to think about the power of framing in Western narratives about
versus barbarism. Africans, corrupt despots, starving victims. Latin Americans, drug lords, football players, dictators. Arabs, terrorists, misogynists. Asians, software engineers, religious fanatics. How does it feel to be fixed, captured, framed? Think of Orientalism as a lens. Use it when you read the media. Spot the stereotype, decode the fiction, unlearn the myth.
Okay, let's go to the next one. Which one are we going to show next?
Which one were we doing?
Let's do Roland Barthes.
Roland Barthes.
Switch on the
Oh, sorry guys.
TV. What do you see? The breaking news graphic, the scrolling text, the news presenter behind the desk. Read the signs, the hair, the makeup, the suit. What is this story about? The rhythm of the words, numbers, colors. Why are these codes here? The music, the size of the letters. How do you feel? A news bulletin is a selection of signs. The flow of words, read of the autocue. The artifice of the presenter's cadence. The news voice. The gaze looking right at you, but through a lens. Visual stand-ins for credibility, authority, legitimacy. Rhetorical motifs constructing the biggest myth of all, that what we are watching is unmediated reality. This is what Roland Barthes would have seen. The TV screen as a cultural text, and he would have unveiled its
What's really interesting to me is when I see slightly empty panels, the people who are there interest me. So why are you?
They should come forward.
This is the interesting bunch.
Yeah,
This is the interesting
bunch who saw critical frames and decided they wanted to come here.
Oh, actually, it's better for them to be behind, isn't it?
Please, can you introduce me as Soria Samora? Let's begin, Raswala. We can begin. Now, what's the time? Is it 4?
Yeah?
Why not? Yeah.
Who's ready?
Yes.
Who's ready?
The mic is ready.
Thank you very much for coming, everybody. My name is Marcela Pizarro. I work for the listening post at Al Jazeera, which is the channel's media critique show. Meenakshi Ravi is the executive producer on the show. Initially, we were meant to be having Soria Samora, who's had to escape to Sierra Leone to carry on filming a documentary. Meen has kindly taken his place and has been very, very involved with me in a media theory project that we're going to be showing you. Lina Atala is an Egyptian journalist who has been at the festival. Luckily, we have the pleasure of having her here and has also taken part in this project. We commissioned articles to come off the back of the project, and she wrote about one of the theorists. I think that one of the first things I'd say, just to place the reason for this, is that I work for a media critique show that on a weekly basis critiques media narratives, traces the discourses of power behind those narratives, unveils their modes of production, traces the economics, the other countries, the global south, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk. This is going to be very much a conversation with amongst us and also amongst you guys. So please, you're invited to interrupt whenever you like. Lina wrote the article about Roland Barthes around the notion of the death of the author. So we invite you to kill us too during this session. We're going to start off with Edward Said. These pieces were done as animations. They last about 2 minutes, and they're explainers of the central concepts behind these theorists. We'll start with Edward Said.
From the beginning of Western speculation about the Orient, the one thing the Orient could not do was represent itself. Evidence of the Orient was credible only after it had passed through the refining fire of the Orientalist work. Edward Said, Palestinian intellectual, literary theorist, historian of the colonial narrative. Said explained how colonialism works not just through armies, but through literature. Not just through conquest, but through anthropology. Not just through oppression, but justified through narrative. He showed how the West painted a picture of the East. Snake charmers, belly dancers, thieves, the exotic, the sensual, the depraved. Said saw it in 19th century Western literature, and you can see it across modern culture. Switch on the news, read the newspapers, look at the images. What stories are you being told? Us versus them. The rational versus the irrational. Civilization